Hey guys, this is Bix Weir, roadrunner.com. I wanted to get this out. This is an old presentation I gave at the Anarchapulco conference in 2018. It was on the gold in the Grand Canyon and some of the proof I have, not all of the proof, but a lot of it, um, proving that there was a huge conspiracy and still is a huge conspiracy going on in the Grand Canyon with the Federal Reserve System. This is called Digesting the Red Pill. It's fairly short, but it sums up a lot of the information I found. There's more after it, but the following information after I published this in 2018, all it did was support the fact that the Fed and the United States government and a lot of governments around the world know what happened in 1913, in the early 1900s in the United States. They found massive amounts of gold when there wasn't really that much gold in the world. And that's why the Federal Reserve was really created. Yes, G. Edward Griffith got it right all the way up to the reason for it, why Woodrow Wilson signed it. So check this out. And I think this is going to be very important in the days, weeks, and months coming as we shift over from a global unbacked fiat monetary system to a gold backed system because there's so much damn gold out there. Silver, who knows? There's so little silver in the world. Absolutely should get all the silver you can. But here's my research and evidence of the gold in the Grand Canyon. Enjoy it. Digesting the red pill, and now you know that there is something else going on at the Fed. There is this secret plan to control markets, for one, to prolong the unbacked fiat system, and then ultimately to destroy markets. So why, on December 23rd, 1913, Woodrow Wilson signed the Federal Reserve Act. And let's get more into the Fed and why this was even allowed. It was late at night, December 23rd, 1913. Anybody who's read Creature from Jekyll Island knows about this conspiracy. If you haven't read it, very important to read this book. But Woodrow Wilson wasn't a shill of the bankers. It's very bizarre. As a matter of fact, here's what Woodrow Wilson said in his book right before he got elected. He said, "Our great industrial nation is controlled by its system of credit. Therefore, all our activities are in the hands of a small group of men who chill and check true economic freedom. We have come to be one of the worst ruled, completely controlled, and dominated governments in the world. No longer a government of the majority, but a government of the opinion and duress of a small group of dominant men." Now, why would someone who believes this sign the Federal Reserve Act? Question number two, and this is the second coin I gave out. Why did Woodrow Wilson sign the Federal Reserve Act? A, he was corrupt and aligned with the bankers. B, he didn't know what he was doing. C, he was blackmailed. Or D, he was afraid of something. And the answer was D, he was afraid of something. This is very clear, and I'll tell you now what he was afraid of. Like I said, what was Woodrow Wilson afraid of? This is what he was afraid of. On June 19th, 2012, cover of the New York Times, this story came out. Tell of vast riches in the Grand Canyon. Men engaged in gold dredging operations expect to astonish the world. Have overcome obstacles. Steamboat placed in the Great Chasm. Large capital only can. So that was the cover, and it went on to talk about, within the article, a lot of things. But here's the most important thing it talks about. F.D. Watson, who has been conducting operations for the Chicago concern, has come out of Lee's Ferry to report to his principals and make further arrangements to carry on the work. He declares that when the whole field has been developed, the supply of gold in the world will have been increased by billions. That's with an S, billions. I know that it will be difficult to comprehend that I have a correct conception of the wealth that is buried in the banks of the Colorado Canyon, he says, but I can demonstrate every statement I make to be absolutely true, and that my chief shortcoming is an inability to comprehend the vastness of the riches that lie along this great stream. Up the Colorado River, 150 miles, there is another great outcropping of the silt, which is being developed by a concern largely financed in the city and in Denver. This extends for more than 18 miles. Then it dips down and has been traced only once before the deposit at Lee's Ferry is again found. It is believed that other deposits can be tapped in Marble Canyon if that is ever made accessible. Remember, this is the early 1900s. The Grand Canyon literally was almost uninhabitable, and it was very hard to get to. Extremely. There weren't roads. You can't land a helicopter in the Grand Canyon. There weren't even helicopters. So it was just as remote as you could possibly get. Now here's the problem with finding billions and billions of ounces. In 1912, there was only 64 million ounces in the United States Treasury. And here's a table showing that. And the total gold reserves in 1913 for all central banks was 160 million ounces. 160 million ounces total in the world, and yet they have found billions and billions and billions of ounces of gold in the Grand Canyon. Here's one of the consequences. This was the consequence of the gold rush in the 1850s, where they found for the U.S., the gold supply increased about 70%. And what it did is cause hyperinflation. As you can see from this consumer price index, the CPI was actually the real CPI back then. It wasn't the fake one we have today, at least I think. Now, obviously, all those numbers are faked. So the ramifications of billions of ounces of gold added to the supply. Number one, the banks and the mega rich, asset value destruction. Remember, the banks and the mega rich and governments are the ones that held most of the gold. They would instantly see the value of their gold depreciate. It would be a total implosion of the monetary system. Obviously, most of the world was on a gold or silver standard. Massive hyperinflation because of all the gold that gets released into the system. And they would have to replace the current monetary system. Perhaps that's why silver is so rigged and so manipulated even more than gold, is because that would be the obvious alternative to a gold standard that got destroyed because billions of ounces were put into that system. Social orders would have been overturned and governments would have been overthrown. All this stuff would have happened. Woodrow Wilson was confronted with this. He went out to the Grand Canyon or had his people go out there to confirm it, and it was absolutely true. So what happened next? The Federal Reserve was created to, quote, deal with the problem. The Chicago and Denver financiers of the Grand Canyon Gold abruptly shut down all mining operations. Woodrow Wilson created the National Park Service. The Grand Canyon was nationalized by designating it the second U.S. national park. Woodrow Wilson banned all mining in the Grand Canyon. 80% of the Grand Canyon is still off limits to hikers. It's unbelievable that people don't jump up and down. You're allowed to go out on this cliff and look over the Grand Canyon. You're not allowed to go and explore around there. There's a couple trails and paths that you're allowed to go down. The donkey ride down to the bottom of the Grand Canyon, but you're not allowed to go everywhere. And it's all cordoned off, and to this day, it's still there. And interesting that 90% of all caves in the Grand Canyon have not been explored. Question number 3. Is the Grand Canyon Gold Conspiracy A, real, B, a myth, or C, both? And the person who answered this question said A, real, but it was actually C, both. And these are pictures I took of the Grand Canyon Gold. No, they're not pictures I took of the Grand Canyon Gold. These are actually pictures. It's pretty cool, but this is kind of what it would look like if these stories are true. Those pictures are from a movie called McKenna's Gold. Really interesting movie. And it very much in line with the Grand Canyon Gold article that came out in the New York Times and the article on Egyptian artifacts that was found. It was written in about the same time, the early 1900s, in the Arizona Gazette, which talks about this find of Egyptian artifacts in these caves in the Grand Canyon. So check out this movie called McKenna's Gold. And an interesting fact about this is that a lot of McKenna's Gold kind of follows the path of how the Egyptian artifacts were found, at least as reported in the Arizona Gazette. But that Arizona Gazette article wasn't found until the 1990s, and McKenna's Gold was made in the 1960s. So really interesting how that story is so much in line with the old Grand Canyon Gold article and the Arizona Gazette Egyptian artifacts in the Grand Canyon. So let's talk about the myth first. A myth is a traditional story, especially one concerning the early history of people or explaining some cultural or social phenomenon. If you've done any history of hidden gold mines or Hopi Indian traditions, there's a place called Cibolo that the Hopi called a city of gold. There's also this, and this is right in the same area. And this area is the confluence of the Colorado River and the Little Colorado River. At a place called Lee's Ferry is where they built a river crossing, because it's almost 100 miles either way. It's almost uncrossable, especially back then. Remember, no roads, primitive crossings were available, but Lee's Ferry was pretty much the only way to cross for 100 miles either way. And it's the area of Sapapapu, which is the Hopi Indians' hole where where their ancestors emerged. The Hopi tradition talks of the Hopi having to go underground and living with the ant people in caves. And then, are there Egyptian artifacts in the Grand Canyon? Absolutely. And if you look at the $1 back of the one, and also the mountains, all the mountains in the Grand Canyon are named after Egyptian gods. And the back of our $1 bill still shows this pyramid. And nobody even questions why a pyramid is on the back of the $1 bill. But you can see in the pyramid, in the back of the $1 bill, clearly on the ground there are bushes. And I don't recall seeing any bushes and leaves and foliage around the base of the Egyptian pyramids. But clearly something is going on that we're not allowed to know about. So what is going on? Let's find out. Is the Grand Canyon story that was published on June 19th in 2012, is it real? Or is it maybe just a fake story? Fake in order to force Woodrow Wilson to sign the Federal Reserve Act. Although I wouldn't think Woodrow Wilson would fall for something that was fake. And I can easily prove that it's not fake. Let's start with the steamboat. Was there a steamboat placed in the Great Chasm of the Grand Canyon? Absolutely, and here it was. It was built in, actually, it's called the Charles H. Spencer, and it was built in San Francisco, brought by train to about 100 miles away, the closest train depot, and then by horse and cart and buggy, and it had to be assembled on site in the heart of the Grand Canyon. Crazy stuff. But this is a picture of it in 1911 when they were building the steamship. And the steamship was used to carry coal from about 20 miles upriver, back and down, because they needed coal to run the hydraulic systems that they were using on the gold and the banks and the walls of the Grand Canyon. And this is the Charles H. Spencer that's tied up on the Grand Canyon. And this picture is in 1912. This is when they finished building the steamship, and this is what was reported on the front page of the New York Times. And voila! By 1951, it had been put out of commission. It was sitting on the side of the Colorado River. There it is. Can you imagine? It took 6 months to get that steamboat out to California and set up. Huge cost, just gigantic cost to do this. And there's also a 100-foot barge that went with it. Crazy that they just stopped, automatically, instantly stopped. And you can find a lot of information. I found a lot of information in this report. There's a picture of the steamship in 1962. This is where I found a lot of information about that steamship. called the Charles H. Spencer. This is a report in 1987 by the Glen Canyon National Recreational Area. They were trying to get the site and the steamship certified as a submerged cultural resource. And this is like a 150-page report. It goes into how it was built, the problems they had getting it there, and all this stuff, and why it is such an important thing. I would say the background is that it's not so important. It was just a steamship that was built for fun on one of the toughest parts of the Colorado River. But I would submit that it was a gigantic deal building this in order to mine the gold in the Grand Canyon and then just shut it down. So in 1930, there was a Supreme Court case, U.S. versus Utah, that fought over mining rights on the riverbanks of the Colorado River. And again, everybody says, oh, no, it's just a beautiful national park. No, it is a huge resource area, mainly gold. There's also some silver there. And this court case has sworn testimony from people who worked the gold mine that it was prematurely shut down. And a lot of the guys said they had no idea why, but all the funding was pulled away, and then Woodrow Wilson locked it up and said no mining in that area. All right, now let's move back to the Road to Ruta comics. This is a really interesting picture within the comic of Ruta, who is Alan Greenspan, talking to his grandmother, who is represented by Arthur Burns, which is Greenspan's mentor. And I get into this in the Road to Ruta analysis. You can find it at roadtoruta.com, the very top video. And Ruta asks his grandmother, why doesn't anybody go to Colorland to bring back colors, meaning why don't we go back to a gold standard? And the grandmother says, because the people who live in Colorland are very big and might accidentally step on any pebble person who visits. All our people are afraid to go there. Now, this is the Federal Reserve Bank talking about this. What could the Federal Reserve Bank be afraid of? And it goes on, and this is the part I want to emphasize. And besides, nobody knows how to reach Colorland. Some say you can get there through the caves near Cobblestone Canyon. Cobblestone Canyon is the name of a canyon in the Road to Ruta comic books where they find gold. Unbelievable. And then Ruta says, I'm not afraid, Grandma. I often play in those caves, and someday I will find a way to bring Colorland back to the people. And it's really, really, really interesting that they use these caves, because it's almost exactly the same as what was going on in the Grand Canyon. And then here we have when Ruta and Rocky is Lowell Wolfbank, Greenspan's computer hardware guy, they find the gold in the Grand Canyon in what they call Cobblestone Canyon. And this is the Federal Reserve Bank. Remember, Federal Reserve doesn't like gold, doesn't deal with gold. Remember Ben Bernanke said, "Oh, we just keep it for historical purposes." It's ridiculous. It is the number one basis for the last 100 years of why the Federal Reserve was allowed to exist. And then Ruta takes the colored flower home, and the colored flowers need the golden sunlight. And here's a really interesting thing, back to that movie McKenna's Gold. In the movie, they find the gold, and then there's a rock slide that covers up the gold, and same thing's happening here with Ruta and Rocky down the bottom. A rock slide is closed off the whole tunnel, and now what do we do? And they find more gold somewhere else, which the U.S. government has at Chocolate Mountain. They found another in California. They found another huge gold mine. Just the parallels are unprecedented. Okay, we're still digesting the Fed red pill. See, there's a lot going on behind the scenes now. Question number 4, was the Grand Canyon gold ever used? A, yes, and it's all gone. B, no, it's still there. C, some was utilized, but most is still there. And D, it's all a crazy conspiracy theory. And the answer is C, some was utilized, but most is still there. I believe. It could be even A and C, but I really think some is left because they have not done significant work, but they have mobilized some of it, and I'll go into how. I know. In 1934, or just recently, a whole bunch of gold-backed bonds were found, trillions of dollars, and there has been some suggestion that these are all fake. And that's what the Federal Reserve said when somebody tried to cash some in, is these are all fake. But it really calls into question, it's clear that these boxes and the certificates and all that are very old, and they would, if anybody carbon dated it, probably would very easily see that these are dated at least 70, 80 years prior to now. So they weren't invented now. They were made in probably the 1930s, and the intricacy of the boxes that they were held in, and the parchment, and the amount of work that went into this is just phenomenal. And it was not easy to do back in 1934, all the printing of these certificates, and it was amazing that they did this. They hid them away, and all of a sudden it's found. So is it fake? I don't think so. These are gold-backed bonds, and I don't think these are fake at all. I think they are the real deal. They might have been already cashed in, which I'll get into in a second, but these are definitely something that are real, because no one would spend all the money to have this done for no reason, because clearly the Fed today isn't going to cash these in. So it isn't someone with a lot of great technology to make things look old, and they're going to spend a couple $100,000 to have these things put together. And there's a lot of them, trillions of dollars in gold-backed bonds. Really interesting stuff, but it gives credence to potentially maybe the Fed in 1934, when they confiscated gold at the end of 33, and now they're issuing these gold-backed bonds around the world. Absolutely makes sense if you have gold in the Grand Canyon and can prove it. You're not going to mine it, but you can mobilize that gold by using gold-backed bonds. And who would accept them? Someone who's been there, someone who's checked out the gold in the Grand Canyon to verify that it's real. Now, here's where we get into a really bizarre part at the International Association of Cryptographic Research. They have one of these mystery gold bars that nobody knows what they are. There's 7 gold bars that have cryptography on them, Chinese writing, U.S. writing, and they speak of a $300 million loan that the Chinese, a gold loan that the Chinese lent the U.S. In exchange for what? Probably those gold-backed bonds. But it is really interesting about these bars, and nobody has been able to decipher them, so they're one of the top 10 mysteries yet to be solved. And here's one of the gold bars that talks about the $300 million loan. You can see the computer, or the numerical and letters and all the cryptography stuff on it, which hasn't been deciphered. And there's Chinese writing and English. But here's a really interesting bar. Check out on the left side, and first of all, look at those. There's an airplane over there, which will be very significant, and all the cryptography. And then it looks like it's layers of gold right here in the bottom with the wiggly lines. Is that a stream? I don't know. Let's think about it though, and check out these symbols, the 0 with a slash through it, and I'll talk about that in a second. But also that these zeros with slash through it looks like it's about half empty. Was gold mobilized from the Grand Canyon? The real stuff, I don't know. But look at this. Here's another bar, and it looks like, unbelievably, it looks like a canyon on the right side, and it looks like a plane crash right above it. Remember that plane? And then the cryptography, and everything else is really clear except that thing. And it really kind of does look like 2 planes crashing right above a canyon. And then the zeros are, for the most part, almost empty of the gold. Really, really interesting stuff. And when you connect that with this, the worst commercial plane crash in history happened in 1956. 128 people died up to that point. And they supposedly crashed right above the very spot where they found the gold in the Grand Canyon. Unbelievable. And it's just an amazing story. And how 2 plane crashes that were leaving from the same airport, one's going to Chicago, one's going to Kansas City, completely different routes, they crash in that exact same spot. A little too conspiratorial, but hey, stranger things have happened. So what happened? There's the route of those doomed airliners, and they cross right above the exact spot where the gold is. What happened was they had to shut down that area of the Grand Canyon, and they used 12 heavy lift helicopters over a 2-week period for supposedly cleaning up the parts of both aircraft. No, there was no plane crash. They used the helicopters to get the gold out, in my opinion. And they couldn't do it without causing a lot of ruckus, so they made up this story. And you go back to those gold bars, and that's exactly what it looked like happened. All right, we're still digesting the red pill.